Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us on such a beautiful evening when you could be out looking at birds. We're particularly excited to be joined by members of the Delaware Valley Ornithological Club tonight. Formed in 1890, the club is celebrated as one of the oldest in the country, and they have held regular meetings here at the Academy for 125 years. So if anybody's interested in learning more, Greg Gorton, who's going to wave his hand, yep, we'll share more. So tonight's conversation has been organized as part of the Academy's Biodiversity Year and in conjunction with our current exhibition, Conversations with Birds. If you haven't yet experienced it, the exhibition will be on view through June 4th. And it celebrates how a passion for birds by birders, like many of you, and citizen scientists contribute to scientific understanding, as well as the stewardship of birds, which we're going to be talking about more tonight. You can also look forward to a second bird-related exhibition called Illuminating Birds. This exhibition, which opens on May 20th, draws upon the Academy's rich library and archives and our historical ornithology collection that Jason here helps to steward, to consider how drawing is a way of knowing. The exhibition explores the role of avian illustration to the popular appreciation as well as the scientific understanding of birds. So through a special collaboration with Philadelphia Mural Arts, the celebrated contemporary artist Jane Kim will produce a new mural for Fishtown featuring local birds while spending time here as an avian artist in residence. Also, a good portion of the exhibition is a studio where anyone interested in drawing or writing about birds will be invited to do so through prompts and workshops. So you can all look forward to that. We are grateful for the partnership with Maiken Scott, host of WHYY's program, The Pulse, for hosting this series of programs related to the importance of biological diversity, the wonderful interconnectedness of life, and the serious crisis that we face with the alarming loss of biodiversity. I will now turn the program over to Maiken, who will welcome our special guests. So thank you all.
Thank you so much, and thank you all for being here. It is beautiful out, so thank you especially. We have great guests on stage here. I'm going to do the short intro. You can always introduce yourselves more if you wish, but we have right next to me Zoe Warner. She is with Williston Conservation Trust and is a grassland bird consultant. And actually, I feel like Zoe and I started this conversation via email after I had done a show about grasslands, and we didn't talk about birds. And Zoe emailed me and she said, "Why didn't you talk about birds?" And I said, "Good point." We will at some other point, so then we started a conversation. So this is how kind of all of this came about. And then right next to her is Jason Weckstein. He is an associate professor in Drexel University's Department of Biodiversity, Earth and Environmental Science, and also obviously here at the Academy, curator of this beautiful place and the birds that are here. And then we have Aaron Kuhlman. He is a MODIS technician and aviation migration ecologist at Willistown Conservation Trust. So thank you for being here, all three of you. And each of you has a mic, and then we just have to click the buttons when we are ready to talk. So Zoe, I was thinking maybe we could start with you. When somebody says the word grasslands, what comes to mind is like vast prairies, or maybe what we'll see in the savannah or something like that. But what is a grassland? What defines it? How big is it?
Well, it sort of depends on where you're talking about the grasslands. So I think what you're talking about is probably what people would imagine if they went out to the Midwest and they see these vast grasslands, the pothole prairies, the short grass, the short grass grasslands, the tall grass grasslands, and these vast open spaces. But here in the East, when we're talking about grasslands, we're actually most of the times talking about artificial grasslands. So we're talking about hayfields that are being used for different agricultural productions. So you can have horse hay, you can have cow hay, which is a little lower quality than horse hay, or you can have mulch hay. which is for the mushroom industry in Kennett Square. And I'm speaking more locally, but on the East Coast,
Yeah.
it is more of these artificial grasslands. So, and these are much smaller than your imagined savannas or that sort of thing. And it sort of depends where you are in the area. I mean, in Chester County, we're really lucky to have these grasslands, these hayfields, as they are, because we're in a sea of development in Chester County. So it's sort of this crazy place where when I first started doing my research, I would be driving out through suburbia, and all of a sudden I'd hit this area and I'd think, wow, Toto, we're in Kansas or something, you know, because it's totally different. So defining grasslands kind of depends on where you are.
And while these fields, these grasslands are really agricultural fields, right? So Jason, I don't know if you can answer this, but birds have come to depend on them, I guess, over decades and decades, have become used to what happens there and how that cycle works, or do they just kind of make use of the habitat that's there?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, there are birds in lots of parts of the world that do that. So, I mean, lots of European birds, for example, rely on human-altered habitats. There are also lots of birds that rely on these huge swaths of prairie and, you know, short grass prairie and tall grass prairie, and really all of those are pretty highly endangered. So whether it's human-associated grasslands or sort of I mean, really even the natural grasslands were probably somewhat, you know, human-associated. You know, native peoples have helped to create those in many cases.
And what are, maybe all three of you can weigh in on this question, maybe Aaron, you could start, but talk a bit about how endangered birds in our region are and what are the biggest threats that they face around here?
Yeah, so a few years ago, there's a paper that came out in 2019 talking about how our birds are in decline, and grassland birds happen to be the clade, the group of birds that are in like steepest decline. And especially on the East Coast, where we have a lot of forest, our birds in particular are declining a lot as well.
And what kinds of birds are we talking about when you say grassland birds?
Sparrows, grassland raptors like red-tailed hawks. You've got American kestrels. You've got bobolinks, blackbirds, stuff like that.
Also, bob whites. That's a kind of a famous one. Northern bob whites are little quail. They, you know, growing up as a kid in southern Michigan, that was a common bird in the farm country when there were a lot of road edges with a lot of grass, and the edges of fields had a lot of grass. And those are really virtually gone from many, many areas, except for the southern U.S., and they're just not abundant anymore anywhere.
And talk a bit about how these birds make use of the grasslands. Like, why are the grasslands so important to them? Zoe, do you want to take that one?
Well, the birds that we are, I mean, the sort of the three main birds that we have that we know are nesting in Chester County are bobolinks, eastern meadowlarks, and grasshopper sparrows. And then we also have kestrels that use nest boxes. But those three species, they nest on the ground. They make these little tiny cups, you know, and then the grass grows high above it and the thatch is over it, and they can, when the babies hatch, they kind of walk out of the nests and walk around on the ground before they're ready to fly. So the way they make use of the grasslands is they're ground nesters, and they have a lot of protection. And they're also really susceptible to predation. So they want to be in these large fields where they're away from the edges, where they're further, they can have a better sight line, they can be away from the predators. And so they really need that time in that interior area to be undisturbed during the whole breeding cycle.
And then what threatens them? What are the biggest threats that they face, Jason? Because they've been there for a long time, it used to work out, and now clearly something is not working
Zoe
out.
would probably be better at answering this,
Okay.
but the short answer is mowing at the wrong time. You know,
Okay.
because these things, you know, they need to nest, they need to have shelter. They feed on insects. So many of these are seed eaters and insect eaters. During the winter, they're feeding on seeds and maybe some insects, depending. But during the breeding season, they're feeding their young insects. So, so you know, we often think of sparrows as being sort of seed-eating things, but they are really exclusively feeding insects, and they need grass for that.
Okay.
Yeah, if I can add to that, you know, as well as like our management tactics, like you were describing, but also our land use tactics. development threatens these grassland birds. So as we have these open meadows and pastures and some land doesn't get used, it might get sold to a developer. Or it might actually get grown into a forest if it lays fallow, things aren't getting mowed, we don't have fire anymore that natives used to have, or that you would, that you would experience from natural events. And so fields get converted into woodlots or into developmental lots.
Is there a role that pesticides play, or is that not as important in this case?
I think it's one of those things where it's a possibility, but because they need these fields, they are in fields that are fertilized. They don't tend to spray in these hay fields as much because it's not like a row crop where they're trying to, reduce the pests. They have more localized spraying if they have like kind of an invasive outbreak. Thistle's a really bad problem, so sometimes they need to get in there and spray it down so that it doesn't take the whole field over. So I think that the answer is it's a good chance that it can affect them, but they're still using these fields, and I don't know. Jason, what would you say?
We do know in general that some insecticides can have impacts on birds. Like there's sort of this newer set of insecticides, neonicotinoids.
Yeah.
And we know that those cause migratory birds, not really grassland birds, but open country birds like white-crowned sparrows they've run experiments on these things. And when they eat neonicotinoids, they don't fatten up properly. So birds have to, when they migrate, they go through this process of hyperphagy. They kind of binge eat and put on a layer of fat. And then they don't leave. They don't kind of go in the right direction. So it is having an impact on birds, definitely, but we don't know the sort of what the sum of that impact is, right?
Okay.
And I wouldn't say that grassland birds would be maybe more susceptible to that, would you? I mean, I sort of...
Hard to know. I mean, if they're in agricultural areas, that's where they're treating with neonicotinoids, so maybe they would be. I mean, I think
And are those systemic kind of insecticides, or what kinds are they?
I think they treat seeds with it,
Yes,
typically.
okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But the birds eat the seeds, and then...
And then
some
they're
of
in
them-
every part.
Exactly.
Got it.
Yeah.
By the way, if any of you have questions, I think we have note cards, right? So everybody has note cards on their chairs. So if you want to contribute a question, just write down your question as legibly as you can, and then we can collect those and we can fold them into the conversation, okay? So we definitely want to get your questions as well. So where do we see the biggest decline? You already mentioned a couple of species, but what is the most worrisome to you, or to any of you, really?
Well, the whole grassland bird family group, they're all they've experienced the steepest declines. So 2/3 of the birds that would be considered grassland birds have experienced 50% population, or I think something like that. And then there's 1/4 of those birds that are actually called tipping point species. And what that means is they've lost 50% of their population over the last 50 years, and they're on target to lose another 50% in the next 50 years if something isn't done. And bobolinks are actually one of the tipping point species. And so, but they're one of the birds that we have here in Chester County, and that we're working for, to meet conservation goals for them.
Yeah.
This is a story that's happening too in the big prairie areas in the Midwest. So a great example that would be lark bunting is a classic, bird of the prairies in the western U.S. And they were in the Midwest. They were in Minnesota. And the University of Minnesota's museum collection has a large series of specimens because they were fairly common in northwestern Minnesota. And those specimens, if you look in the collection, go up to 1960, and then they just disappear. So there are no more in the collection after that time point because they don't exist in the state of Minnesota anymore, basically because the prairie was just so destroyed, basically.
Yeah.
And 1960 is kind of a pivotal time for grassland birds, because that's actually when mechanization of the farm equipment changed. So actually these birds were here on the East Coast with Native Americans doing burning and having some prairies. But when European settlers came and cleared more area for agriculture, these birds actually increased in population during that period.
Because they like that.
Yeah, because all of a sudden they had more habitat. It was like, hey, we're opening up the forest for you.
Yes.
Come on in. But then 1960 was kind of the time when management changed. So it was increased mechanization. Sometimes they were trying to get more than one cutting off of the field. That was really the beginning of this decline.
Okay. And Erin, you do some work in terms of tracking bird populations. Talk a bit about how you do that, what that work looks like.
Yeah, so as my title suggests, I'm a MODIS technician. That is, MODIS is a series, it's a network, it's a series of automated radio receiving stations. Basically, throughout North America, there's, I don't know, 500 or 700, 1,000 receivers, and basically it's a passive receiving station, and it listens for birds that are flying by. And these birds might have a tag that sends out a little radio frequency pulse, and we can then take that data picked up by these passive receiving stations, and we can identify which species that is. So
identify them how? How do you identify them? By their song?
The tag is.
Oh, you have a tag on them, right?
Yeah. You would capture a bird. You would put a little tag on it. It's very lightweight, sometimes like as small as like 1/3 of a gram. So you can put this on something like a black-polled warbler, weighs 10 grams, like the weight of a penny. And you can put a little tracking device on it. It's not going to affect the bird's behavior. And then as that bird's flying by one of these receiving stations, that tag is sending out a pulse, which has a unique number, a unique signature attached to that bird, the metadata attached with that bird, and we can see from home, like, oh, hey, the black-polled warbler just flew by Penn DRL, which is one of our MODIS stations.
And then do you make assumptions from that? Like if that one guy with the tag is there, probably a bunch of others are flying by as well? Because you probably don't have tags on all the birds, right?
Correct. We don't have tags on all the birds, but the beauty of MODIS is that the tags are relatively inexpensive. If you're thinking about something like Project Snowstorm is a great example of a telemetry project where you tag, you put a satellite tag on a snowy owl. That might cost $2,000, $3,000 for that one tag. A MODIS tag costs $200. So if you get a grant to study a species, you can study like larger populations at pretty good cost, and I can put 20 tags on like a bird and see like a good number of birds in the species in the region and in their movement patterns. And this is something we've done with bobolinks, with Zoe's project in Chester County and Willistown Conservation Trust. We've kind of developed this network where we can follow the tracks of these bobolinks through our grasslands and watch them as they migrate.
And what kind of patterns do you see emerge from that work? Is anything changing in terms of how they go back and forth, when they do it, all of those things?
So, well, one of the things that came up was, we have partnered with other researchers in New England, in Maine and Vermont. And so for the past 2 years, we've all tagged birds in these 3 different locations. And so we were looking at, is there connection among their migratory path? And one of the things that emerged was all of the birds from these 3 separate populations are stopping in the Delmarva Peninsula. And so what that means then when you get that kind of data is that all of a sudden you have real evidence to say, I mean, you might have anecdotal evidence, oh, we seem to see a lot more bobolinks down here, but you have scientific evidence to say these birds really are coming here, and then that can help sort of power management decisions. What do you do with those fields during that time when you know that they're so important to these different populations of birds? So that's one example of using that data then to make real conservation decisions.
Got it.
The other piece of this technology is that the old-fashioned way, and we still do this, right, was to ban birds, and we still ban birds because it's cheap and we can put it
banned with a D.
Banned with a D. You put a little ring on the bird.
Yep.
In Europe, they call it ringing, and that ring has a unique number so it's like a little bracelet on that bird that tells you who that bird is. But to get information about that bird, you have to recapture it again, right? So if you want to know, did it change weight? Did it go to a different place? You have to catch it again, and that's a pretty rare event to recapture birds. So this MODIS technology is kind of like Uber banding. You basically put this tag on, and when that tag pings at a tower somewhere, it's telling you where that bird went, or that bird's still alive, or that bird moved to a different place. It's not going to get you really precise tracks, but it gets you a lot more information than you would have with just a band. So.
Yeah, so it's almost like a cell phone signal when we're
Exactly.
tracking somebody.
Yeah,
And we're
it's like if your cell phone pings
yes,
every so often.
yes.
Yeah.
And what do these towers look like, Aaron?
It's kind of like an old radio or like an old TV antenna, but it's
Okay.
like a really big form of it. You would take like any kind of vertical structure. It doesn't really matter. That's not the important part. But what you see are just these long antennas. Some of them are like 11 feet long. Some of them are like 3.5 feet long, and they just got elements going across it. So you look at a MODIS station, it's like, this is the latest like bird tracking technology. What is this? But it's the application of how we're using these miniaturized tags, and then listening for these radio waves.
And talk a bit more about the work of capturing the birds and then getting the tags on them. When do you catch them and how, and then where does the tag go?
Yeah, you can catch bird on migration, and you can put a tag on it. So like at a banding station.
So you put out nets, or
Yeah, you might take a mist net. That's a common method for trapping birds. They're just really fine mesh. They're not monofilament, but they're multiple strands. They're really finely meshed. They're hard for the birds to see. You put it in like a hot spot of bird activity. A bunch of federally licensed banders will get out in the morning. They'll catch a bunch of birds. If you catch the bird that you want to put a band or a tag on, you've got different methods for doing it. For a songbird, like a bobolink, you might take a material called like stretch magic, or something that's strong but lightweight, and there's a couple of different methods. You can wrap it around the legs, you can glue it to the back of the bird, or you can put it around the wings, depending on what species you're looking at. And the important thing is that these transmitters don't last forever. Some of them are supposed to, but theoretically the battery is going to die, and therefore the harness is also designed to fall off over some period of time, like 9 months, a year, 2 years, something like that.
got it. So the bird is like, whew.
Yeah. Get
Finally,
rid of that. But
that thing is off my back.
yeah, when you release a bird, it's important to like watch it afterwards, like make sure it's behaving normally.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Can you tell if a bird has died? Does, because it just doesn't show up again, or can you assume it flew somewhere else, or how do you figure that out?
That's a good question. You can make some assumptions about what's going on with the bird, depending on if you're seeing that transmitter being detected or not detected. If you tag the bird at a certain station and it doesn't go anywhere and it just stays there, and you're like, this bird should have migrated 3 months ago and it's still pinging every day, it might be like dead somewhere. Or you might not even see those pings because the battery might have died if it got like predated by something. So it depends on your situation, depends on the type of tag you're using.
Yeah.
There are instances of researchers, actually one of the DVOC members who is an ornithologist and studied ospreys. These are big birds of prey that feed on fish, and they use the big tracking devices that are either GPS or cell phone tower oriented, and so they can gather large amounts of data, detailed tracks. And he had a bird that didn't move, and it was in Venezuela, and he actually got somebody to go and find the bird and get the tag and send it back to him.
Wow.
Yeah.
And the bird was dead?
The bird was dead, yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, migration is a very dangerous thing.
Yeah. And Zoe, have you seen anything really surprising in evaluating this data, or any outliers or any new information that caught you by surprise?
I don't know if anything has particularly surprised us, but I think it kind of solidified some of the ideas that we had already. One kind of a cool anecdote was we caught one bird in this one field in 2021, and bobolinks are known to be have site fidelity, so they're expected to come back to the same field the next year. We actually recaptured him the second year, and when we looked at his migration track from year to year, he was like just a creature of habit. I mean, he was hit on almost the same MODIS towers. His tracks could almost line up if you put them over each other. So that was just, I think, sort of proving what we already knew, but it's always sort of nice to actually see it and say, oh, this bird really did come back to this field, and here he is. And then we know that he he made it through migration and all of the life cycle things that happen after he's on the breeding ground, and he actually managed to come back and do it all again the next year.
How many years of data do we have now using this technology?
It depends on the project.
Okay.
So it would be, I mean, I don't know when the first tags were placed, but.
Modus as a project started in 2012.
Okay,
It really
so 10 years.
Yeah, it really started taking off in about 2019, 2020. There's been a substantial increase. I couldn't really estimate like a percentage, but there were a few products that were put on the market around that time that really increased the efficiency of data gathering. We've got these products that can essentially, in real time, upload these tag detections rather than driving out to your remote station, downloading the data, bringing it back. If that station is 200 miles away, you might only get out there twice a year. But some of these sites that, for our network and the Northeast Modus Collaboration, the group that I work for, we manage 150 stations or so, basically from Virginia Beach all the way up through Maine. We obviously can't hit all of these stations. They're uploading data to us automatically. So,
Oh, that's amazing. So
yeah.
you're really building a good base of knowledge here.
It's
in
a
terms
substantial
of,
network.
Yeah, that's
And
amazing.
it's international too. So the Northeast Modus Project has partnered with Birds Caribbean, so they're putting stations up in the Caribbean. And there are stations in South America, obviously not as many, but we had our first international detection this past year. So it was right at the tip of in Colombia, so it was sort of the gateway down to where their wintering grounds are. But you know, the idea would be to have a network large enough that you could actually follow the entire migration.
There are Modus stations on 6 of the 7 continents, the one not being Antarctica. But Africa has officially one station in Egypt, I think, somewhere in northern Africa. Australia has a bunch, Europe has a bunch, and there's a few in Asia as well.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's amazing. I got a question here from the audience which says, in the South, there has been a relatively successful pocket prairie movement. Is there an analog movement in the Northeast to, you know, in Northeast or in northern cities that tend to be more dense? So are you familiar with this movement? You're not? It sounds to me like it's part where you protect areas of grassland, right? So is there anything akin to that that people are doing here, trying to protect at least some partial area where birds can still nest and stay?
I'm not aware of anything, but the one thing about these birds is they need wide open spaces. So even if you had a small grassland, it would not likely be inhabited. So a lot of times if you go to your local park or something like that and you see a field, you think, oh, I should see these birds here, but it just may not be big enough. And when you think about the size, it's not just about the area, but it's also about the interior area. So if it's a very convoluted sort of shape, you have a lot of edge in there, and they want to get away from those edges, so they're going to move into the middle. And if there's not that much space in the middle, it doesn't actually give them that much space to breed. So the pocket prairies would be good for pollinators and other species like that are more edge species that could use it. But these birds, one of the reasons why they're in decline is they need these wide open spaces.
It's possible, like birds like Bob White's, these quail, you know, I think one of the things that was a real problem for them is that hedgerows that were, you know, scrubby, road edges that were scrubby have been, you know, herbicided and cut and mowed. So there's not, you know, I think they did well in that kind of habitat historically, but.
Do they mind each other? Like, once they find a space that's good for them, do they want a certain amount of distance from each other, or are they okay kind of being relatively close?
They're territorial. So you'll see, especially coming in the early, before breeding starts, they're setting up their territories and they're staking them out and they're, you know, displaying and they're making sure nobody's coming in. But the interesting thing is we have one field that it's not a great breeding field because it doesn't have those kind of wide open spaces. It's sort of a valley, and because of that, they don't have good sight lines. And so the birds don't breed there. But once they've finished breeding, fields around them have been mowed. This area is not mowed because it's managed with cows. You'll see you know, it's a bobolink field. You'll see all these bobolinks come. Sometimes you'll see like a stalk of grass just dripping with like 3 or 4 bobolinks all on the same grass. So it kind of depends on the time of year. So they do mind each other when they're breeding, but later on they can be more congenial.
And we've touched a bit on predators already, or on the threats that these birds face, but are there any kind of changes in the predators that are around that affect these bird populations?
I mean, some of the grassland birds that are in decline are predators. You know,
Right.
things like northern harriers and kestrels, short-eared owls. Those are grassland birds.
Cooper's hawks often can't. Cooper's hawks often can, which is it's a forest raptor. It's like a really quick, short or long-tailed, short-winged raptor, and it can prey on species in the grasslands. And so, as Zoe was kind of describing, when you have these fields they're not big, they don't have like they don't have a good buffer zone in the breeding field. If you've got woodland that approaches some of these fields, you can get like a Cooper's hawk or a sharp-shinned hawk that can just pick off these bobolinks or these grassland birds one by one. They're just sitting on a little perch and like, ooh, that's an easy food to pick up. Yeah. So
One sort of unsurprising, or one sort of surprising predator that, I mean, it's sort of opportunistic, but deer will eat their baby. The eggs. So
What?
the increased deer population could affect it.
Oh, I didn't
they'll-
realize deer would eat eggs.
Yeah, they will.
Huh.
And maybe the babies
Is this a
too.
new? Is
Yeah,
this a new
I think
taste
there
they
are
acquired?
instances of them eating babies. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh,
that's a common issue in Canada where there aren't a lot of predators, like mammalian predators, but like for species that are nesting in shrubs and stuff, deer will absolutely depredate bird nests when there's not a lot of food available.
huh. Another question. What are the most critical native plants to preserve for migratory birds on the East Coast? Any thoughts there?
I'm the wrong person to ask.
Yeah.
I mean, that really
I
depends
know
on
Midwestern plants
Yeah,
better than
that depends on your location and like how much space you have. What kind of birds are you interested in? If you want like woodland birds, get a lot of good shrubs with fruit and little small fruiting trees, understory trees. If you have a lot more space, you've got like 5 acres. Put some little bluegrass in your yard and let your grass grow. Those are going to be like probably more impact than anything else. But I don't know. Ask Doug Tallamy. Get his book. He'll have the good answer for you.
Another question we got is how much grassland habitat loss is due to development versus reverting to forests, especially on the East Coast? Any thought there?
I mean, I don't have specific numbers, but I think development would be the major, problem. I mean, how often do you actually see a field that is succeeding to forest? I mean, usually it's a field that's going to be bought and sold and put some houses on it.
Yeah.
So housing development is really the big problem. But in Chester County, they've made this concerted effort through conservation easements and ag easements, and they actually have created this sort of agricultural green belt that's really it's surprising considering how the population in Chester County is growing.
Mm-hmm. Talk a bit about the work you're doing with farmers to preserve some of these birds or to change some of what the farmers might want to do in order to help out these bird populations.
Well, so what we've found is that as we've said, the mowing is occurring during breeding season, but we're actually in a unique situation in Chester County that the hay doesn't have to come off early because it's used for mulch hay for the mushroom industry. And it's actually beneficial to let that hay season in the field because the farmers aren't taking it off for quality, they're taking it off for quantity. So the seed heads get bigger throughout the season. So what we actually found when we talked to the farmers was they said, well, we wouldn't mind mowing later in July. But a lot of times they've had some pressure from they lease the land from landowners, and sometimes the landowners are saying, well, when are you coming? Oh, I saw my neighbor get their field mowed. Are you coming? So what we've been doing is we've tried to start this sort of three-legged stool with landowners, farmers, and other conservation organizations to come together and say, which fields can we let go longer? Where do we, some of the hay has to come off early. I mean, farmers are making a living, but where does it feel like it could be a place where it's going to be okay and the landowner's okay with it? So we're starting that this season, is getting commitments from certain fields that they won't mow before July 1st, and we'll be monitoring to see what's happening in those fields. So the idea is that once we get this one field season under our belts, we can start to look at which fields we might want to include in the next season and that sort of thing.
And what's the reaction you get? Are people generally interested? Are they open to the idea? Do they want to be part of this?
They are, and it's been really, it's really been gratifying to see how much people care for the land, as they call it, and they see the benefits of it. And we have one landowner that I met way back when I was doing my dissertation, and she was aware of the birds, but I think the more we've been there and the more we've talked about what's happening on her property, she's become really sort of passionate about it. And so I think it's a feeling that is growing, and I guess also I think maybe they're realizing it's not impossible, that there are things that can be done, especially as we're talking with each other, and nobody is pointing a finger and saying you're doing the wrong thing or you must do this, but it's more, I think, working in partnership to come to a solution that works for all the partners.
Have you seen any changes in terms of these birds with climate change that maybe has come out of the MODIS data too? Because we talked about how the mowing impacts them with the breeding season, and I'm wondering if the breeding season is maybe happening at a different time, and so cycles shift and then everything gets out of whack.
I'm not our data specialist. I do a lot of back end work and technical work. One of the panelists who wasn't able to come, Shelley, she is a MODIS data specialist. She deals with large pools of data. That's a great question, and that's a question we could probably answer maybe in a few years. We certainly have the network to develop it, but as an example, she just kind of gave us a summary of our data that we have on just our stations in the Northeast, again from Virginia Beach to Maine. We've got 52 million detections on just those 150 stations.
Oh wow!
So that's not a small data set at all. So it's you need to know how to manipulate large numbers or large pools of numbers. And I don't have a good answer for you, but that's definitely something that that's a great application of the technology that we're developing.
So the one thing to remember is that there's a really big genetic component to birds sort of when they leave to come north, let's say, right? So, because there are cues, right? So some of the cues that birds take that help them to know when it's time to migrate are change in day length. But if it's a bird migrating to the equator, day length doesn't change, right? Day length is 12 hours daylight, 12 hours of night when you're on the equator. So there's also an endogenous clock that birds have that tell them when it's time to move and when it's time to have life cycle changes. So it's a combination of those things. So that means that climate-driven changes to bird populations are going to be generally kind of slow. They're not something you're going to see in a few years, maybe decades. You may see some changes, and there are migratory birds where we have seen some changes in arrival dates, but we all, all of us that are bird watchers, we all think oh, it's so warm, we're going to see all this stuff early, and occasionally we see something early, but we're not seeing, warblers, showing up 3 weeks before they're supposed to.
Okay, and that's sort of the thing with climate change is that the birds are continuing their patterns, but other things are changing. So they talk about the asynchronous patterns. So the insects are emerging earlier. Or for example, with the grasslands, I was talking to one of our farmers, and he said, "I think we're running 2 weeks ahead. Do you think the birds are going to finish nesting early?" And so. But it's that's his reality. Is he's still thinking about when am I getting this hay off? So that's the problem more is the discontinuity with the different cycles.
Question from the audience. Are you aware of problems with invasive grasses in our area that cause a problem for these birds? And it says that is a huge problem in the grass birds of southeastern Arizona, where birders love to go.
Oh, okay. Not, I mean, not really, because as I said, these birds are using artificial grasslands anyway. They're cool season grasses. They're not, they're not native to the area. So I guess technically you could say it's all invasive, although they're being seeded. I mean, they're not just coming in on their own. There are invasive weeds, noxious weeds like thistle, that can take over a field, and then that's a problem for the farmer and for the birds.
And for the birds, I guess, because you can't.
Although
use-
the goldfinches don't mind.
Another question, and we might have answered this, but I'll just ask it again. What grassland bird is the canary in the coal mine? When this bird disappears from your grassland community, it indicates instability and community-wide decline. Any one of them that you kind of feel
I don't
like
know
is
if we
that?
have
Are you
one.
bold enough, Jason?
Yeah.
I mean, I guess it depends on which grassland. I mean, here that's just a much more depauperate grassland community. So
Yeah.
it's meadowlarks, bobolinks, if those
Grasshopper
things-
sparrows
yeah,
are the
that
only
too.
ones that are
Yeah.
considered technically
sensitive.
threatened
Yeah.
in this area. So bobolinks and meadowlarks still haven't been, they're still, I guess, considered all right, but grasshopper sparrows are
I mean,
threatened.
generally, when I think of grasshopper sparrows, I think of something that likes shorter grass a little bit. So it seems like that would be more, kind of a rarer microhabitat than.
And
what
they
the others
nest
do.
later too.
Yeah.
So even if you're able to manage for the bobolinks and meadowlarks, it could cause a problem for the grasshopper sparrows if they're coming in and nesting 2 weeks later.
Another question, this one is sort of related to how species often tend to adapt to changes. Do you see any prairie species adapting to becoming edge species? So do you see any changes, maybe if you can't answer this specific question, maybe do you see any ways in which these birds are adapting? Not yet, too soon?
Not yet.
I would think that would be a really, evolutionarily, that would be a super quick response. These birds, develop their habitat preferences over millions of years. I doubt that a grasshopper sparrow is going to get really friendly with an oak tree anytime soon.
We don't know. Jason, I wondered if you can talk a little bit about the collection you have here at the Academy, which we've been able to see some of it out there in the exhibit, and how that species sort of tells a story over time and is very much used in research now. I think sometimes it's like we can look at these beautiful birds, but this is very much also a way for us to do research on things that are happening now.
Yeah, so I think, the great thing about collections is that they are, these are like libraries of biodiversity. So we have specimens from a wide range of dates, a wide range of places, and that can tell us about change over time. So it could be understanding how climate affects things. So colleagues of mine at one museum have collected building-killed birds from one building in Chicago, and they've measured those specimens that were collected from 1970 till present, and there actually are changes in body size and wing length that happen.
wow.
So that's an example of kind of microevolution happening over time, maybe climate-driven microevolution. That's one example. This example of the lark buntings that I told you about, where we see them blink out in the collection, they blink out in the collection because they don't exist in those places anymore. And I think collections can tell us lots of stories about that. They can help us understand what birds are eating. So there was a study of a group of insect-eating birds called nightjars, and one of the things that these researchers looked at, they looked at isotopes in the feathers, different forms of elements in the feathers, and those isotopes can tell us what the bird was feeding on when it grew its feathers. And that can tell us where the bird came from, because different regions have different isotope makeups, but it can also tell us what different kinds of foods. And one of the things that they found when they were studying these nightjars is that the insects that they were feeding on changed from the past to the present. And we know that there's this big insect apocalypse, lots of insects have disappeared, and the birds are telling us that too from looking at feathers from old museum specimens. So lots of different things that we can learn from them.
Yeah, so it's really important to have this
Exactly.
backlog of
Yep. Yeah, we want
exhibit.
to have time series. People often ask, like, why do you need so many cardinals or so many white-throated sparrows? Like, why do we continue to take white-throated sparrows that hit people's windows? Because those are the things that are going to actually tell us a lot of stories, because we can have large sample sizes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. We got a question from the audience about the place where you two work, and this audience member wanted to know a little bit about the history of how this how this all came about, how the trust came about, and the conservation trust came about, and just tell us a short version of the history. It says here.
Well, our founder actually was instrumental in preserving a lot of the land that was in southern Chester County. But she and a group of people who were really, I guess, just friends who loved Willistown and who loved where they lived, saw the development happening in Chester County.
Yeah.
So they began plotting out the areas that they wanted to preserve, and they've been very successful. It's when you look at a map of Chester County, you can see that agricultural green belt, and then you see the CO development, and then right there, close to close to Delaware County, I guess it is, or wherever the border is, you see this green, this big green dot there, and that's Willistown. That's the preservation that they've been able to do and maintain this agricultural area. I mean, a lot of it is not maybe used for agriculture anymore, but it's just the landscape, that agrarian landscape.
Do you have any sense of how big these fields have to be to make a difference for birds? Like, what size are we talking about?
I mean, when we're looking for a field, we're going to look for nothing less than a 25-acre field, and that's really on the small side. But the fields that are most productive are going to be like 100 acres, 120 acres. And as I said, they're going to be those more wide open. So you wouldn't want a 100-acre strip that went, went on forever, because it just doesn't provide enough of that interior area.
Yeah.
To add a little bit to the question about the history of WCT, as we call it, Willistown Conservation Trust. I think it started in 1987, maybe 85. We had two founders, Bonnie Van Allen and Alice Hausman. They grew up in the Willistown area. For those who aren't familiar, it's southeastern Chester County, kind of about 15 minutes east of West Chester. And yeah, they, as Zoe was saying, they kind of noticed the encroachment of development nearby. And it's got this really great agricultural character. There's a lot of horse pastures in these areas and a lot of grazing lands. And the residents of this area, they really appreciated that character. Lots of kind of rolling hills. It's quite a beautiful area to go. And so they really wanted to make sure that that didn't turn into housing developments and stuff. And we actually have seen a bit of that impact in the Willistown area. And so as an organization, WCT is a land trust. Like, that's their primary goal, but then we have a few divisions and like concentrations, like our bird conservation program where Zoe and I are working under. We have like regenerative agriculture, we've got a watershed program, we've got land stewardship. So there's a lot to go on there to kind of make all these pieces work to kind of promote the ethic of like land conservation.
Let's talk a bit more about policy in general. Do any of you see great examples of policy that is aimed at conservation, at saving the kinds of birds we're talking about, beyond what individual trusts or organizations can do?
Well, there is money in the Farm Bill that can be used for bird conservation. I think in a lot of ways, it's difficult to sort of lay down a policy that would work, sort of a blanket policy, because the areas where these birds are different in terms of their goals. So, for example, there are a few different areas that are bobbling hotspots. So in Vermont, they have dairy farming, and so they're going to farm differently than the mulch hay farmers. And then in Virginia, they have cattle farming. So to have policies that meet those needs, I think it can be difficult. But what in those three areas, what has been working is just sort of figuring out how to form partnerships and figure some things out. One policy that has been used is sort of a pay-to-delay program. They use that in New England, where farmers will say, it's going to cost me this much to delay my haying, so then they're paid the difference, and so then that keeps them whole. That's it. So that's one model of a sort of a monetary policy that has been proven to work.
A lot of states also have like CRP land. It's basically like land that's set aside, not harvested or plowed for crops, so that it gets left all season.
But one issue that I think happens with that CRP
Grows
land,
up, yeah.
well, it's also just that they don't have a lot of stipulations around it. So I was with one farmer, and she said, "Oh, I've got this CRP land down there. Tell me if I have anything." Or tell me I'm saving meadowlarks. Then it was like a riparian buffer. So if the policy isn't strict enough in terms of this is what we're looking
Saving
for,
grassland birds,
yeah,
yeah.
it has to be these dimensions. It's sort of, you're paying somebody to not use their land for farming, but the benefit on top of that is somewhat questionable.
I don't know if you can answer this question, but I'll try. How many breeding pairs can occupy 100 acres of grassland? Any clue?
Well, they have about a 1 acre territory.
What?
But
wow.
then on top of it, and I'm thinking of bobolink specifically, because those are the
That's a huge territory.
Yeah, and then you have to cut out areas for edges. So we have one field that's like, I think it's at like 120 acres, and it's very interesting. The one part of the field, you don't see birds nesting up there at all. Then the bobolinks are kind of down the center. Then you have red-winged blackbirds that are in the wetter area, and they're in their own section. And then you have meadowlarks that nest kind of on the edges more of the fields. So they've broken up the fields into their own little, areas, and then within that, you have to have space for the territories too.
Huh.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
So so I don't know much about bobolink life history. Do males have one female, or harems like red-winged blackbirds?
They're
do?
polygamous.
Yeah.
So yeah,
So it's like a
they'll-
male territory with a whole bunch of little female
Oh,
territories.
yeah. I was going to
within it.
say this is not very
Yeah.
efficient. If you need like 1 acre, I mean, come on. For one, I thought they needed 1 acre for like 2 birds.
Yeah. No, but it is
Okay.
interesting. There's a whole working group called the Eastern Working Grasslands Group, I think, and they're trying to figure out, acres, dollars, and people. Well, how many acres do we need? What workforce do we need to be? What research base do we need? And
Right.
how much is it going to cost? And it's really based on the 3 billion birds, saying that grassland birds are in the greatest decline. And so, what are we going to do about it?
And then I guess we have to track like how many babies do we get out of each acre, right? Return on investment.
Right. And many of the babies won't make it through that first year. It's something like a 60% death rate.
Yeah, this is true of any migratory
Oh,
bird, right?
God,
So
yeah.
any migratory bird, they're flying across the Gulf of Mexico, they're flying across the ocean, so they are, some of these things make a single flight off the Atlantic coast and go all the way to South America. So these are long, dangerous flights, and the first flight generally is not high survival. So once you've made it once, you have a pretty high probability of continuing to do that, but first time around is not easy.
Yeah, I would imagine. Do you know, this is another question, do you know if land trusts have been successful in other contexts, such as cities? Are you aware of any other efforts that sort of have made a difference?
Well, I mean, land trusts are across the country, and there's big ones and there's small ones. The Nature Conservancy they do conservation easements, so that's one of the, that's a global agency. It's not particularly land trust, but so I think in cities a lot of times it's they're working more on forgetting the name of it, but they do more like housing.
Yeah.
So there are different ways land trusts can operate, but land trusts have been successful in preserving a lot of land because the model they use is using conservation easements. So people who have properties that they don't want to see developed, but they don't necessarily want to, make it a park and move away from their property, they're able to just sell their development rights and maintain their property in private hands and pass it on to their children or whatever it is. And so that's been a successful model, and it's been also upheld in the courts because this land is preserved in perpetuity, so it will never be developed. And there have been people who have tried to break these easements.
Another question, have you or anyone done any insect surveys to look at that variable in terms of its impact on the birds?
I have not.
I don't know the answer, but I'm sure that
Somebody
has.
is doing
yeah,
it,
I mean,
yeah.
prairies are so important, that absolutely someone's got to have done that, but I don't know what the data is on any of that.
It definitely happens at one of our public preserves, Kirkwood Preserve. I'm not involved in it at all, but I know that there is an insect sampling protocol. I almost want to say it's like a Drexel or somebody like school group that does it, but I'm kind of like, I just know that it exists. I don't know anything about
Could be
it.
one of my colleagues here at the
It
Academy.
could be.
I know
Ask
the
around.
Academy has been out to Willistown, to collect insects and see what's in some of those places, but
It's definitely not foreign to an ornithologist to do an insect survey. Like that's a huge part of like making sure that food is available for the birds.
And then one question we got here, which is sort of a nice way to wrap up, is what can average people do? What are things that people can do to help these bird populations? We don't have 100 acres probably, but are there things that people like all of us in the audience can do to contribute in some way? And let's all of you weigh in on that question.
Well, Aaron had mentioned Doug Ptolemy, who has this initiative that he's begun called the Homegrown National Park. And the idea is that sometimes we can feel a great sense of despair when we think about all the things that are happening, that are really environmentally detrimental.
Yeah.
And we feel like we don't have any control over it because it's so out there. So his idea is, let's start with the spaces we do control. So in your own yard, you can start to put native plant species that will support birds and support the insects that they eat. Plant an oak tree. So the idea is that if we can all start to take some of our grass away and make these small little meadows, we'll create a connectivity across the landscape that would be, it'll help the birds to go, they don't have to move from one preserved area to another, but there's all these little satellites in between. And so he did the math and he found out that if we all took some percentage of our yard, we would have the largest national park in our country.
And when you say take the grass away, you're talking about lawns specifically?
So reducing the lawn and not having, he always says lawns are wonderful pathways. So you use the lawn to weave your way through all of your little gardens.
Through your grassland.
Yes, exactly.
And I think supporting organizations that that are able to go out there and conserve big patches, advocating, voting for the right people that care about this stuff. This is like state, national, local. There are like governments preserve property too and land. So we just have to fight for that kind of stuff too.
This conversation is largely revolved around like migratory species. One of the biggest impacts to migratory species, especially for songbirds who are migrating at night. Advocate for your little township or wherever you're from. Turn your lights off at night. Put caps on the lights so that birds aren't getting blinded as they're navigating. These birds that are navigating at night, they're using stars, so they're using these lights above them to navigate north. So something as simple as doing that, which we can't do much about, the big skyscrapers in New York City and those larger infrastructures, but it does make a difference coming down to the township level and even your own house. Just kind of like doing all the little things that how. So that's a pretty big impact if you can just remember to turn your garage light off, turn your front porch light off.
The interesting thing is it's not necessarily the big skyscraper that is the biggest killer of birds. It's often very low buildings that just have a lot of glass or a lot of lights on. So treating glass or putting treated glass into buildings that we build is important. The other big one, the one that's actually a bigger killer than buildings, is feral and outdoor cats. So don't let your cat outside, don't release cats, don't feed cat colonies. And you look at a lot of these. you look at a lot of these rural
Thankfully,
areas.
you're among friends.
Yeah, exactly.
You can't make that argument in some other groups.
If you drive through the farm country, you often see barnyard cats, and
Yeah.
I'd imagine that they are. You asked about predators earlier, and it didn't pop into my head.
Yeah, I was
but
kind of
barnyard-
hinting at the
yeah.
cat thing. I wasn't going to say it, but
Yeah, certainly. I mean, when I drive, drive to visit family in Michigan, we always see cats along the highway
Yeah.
road edges, and those are just
Cuddly
feral
killers.
cats. Yep. they're
Yep.
Cuddly killers. Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, do you have a favorite among these birds? And if so, why? What do you love about them? Or do you love them all equally?
Well, I definitely, my favorite is the bobolink. And it's,
Why?
It's got this song that they say it's the R2D2 song. And it sounds,
How does it go?
oh,
goes-
Jason did it, right?
I can't quite do it, but it's kind of like pink, 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 bobolink, bobolink. It's kind of, I can't whistle it. It's impossible to
But a
whistle.
much more like a tingy and
Yeah,
mechanical.
it's this crazy
add that on top
it
of what
sounds
you
like
did.
R2D2. I mean, that's
Yeah,
a pretty good
yeah.
explanation. And it's got a white and yet like creamy yellow back. I mean, they're gorgeous birds, the males.
They look like they're wearing a backwards tuxedo with a dapper little cap, a little
Yeah.
yellow cap on the back of their head. And they're just so lively. They'll
they
fly
kinda
up in the
hover,
air
yeah.
and they'll come down and they're singing. And so it's really a spectacular sight, especially when you're tired in the morning, going out to band and you'd rather be in bed maybe, and all of a sudden the bobolinks start coming up. It wakes you up.
A lot of grassland birds do flight songs. So even if you go out on the short
Not
grass,
fight songs,
no,
but
flight
songs.
songs, yeah. And they, so some of them, like Sprague's pipit is this bird that's out in the tall grass prairies in the west, and they fly up, just way up into the sky, and they do this kind of downward spiraling, teedly, 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 and I mean, the sounds out in grasslands and prairie are pretty spectacular.
Yeah. Did you find the song?
Yeah, I was sneakily pulling up a bobolink.
Yes,
song.
good. That's what
For
phones
those who
are
don't
good
know, I'm
for.
assuming that many of you do, but we'll see if this comes through at
Yeah,
all.
okay. You have to hold the mic to it. Yeah. Oh, that's so nice.
Yeah, it's pretty
My
wild.
imitation.
And we got one more note here that says, I'm an architect and interested in flat roofs, acres of them, converted as bird habitat. Example, the convention center roof. So I don't know if you've heard of any of those kinds of efforts, but that's just like one great idea to use space that already exists and is not doing anything right now.
There is an open country bird that is on the decline a lot because of roofs, and that is the common nighthawk. So this is a bird, in the fall we get good numbers migrating through here, and they do nest in the city, but they used to nest in cities a lot more when we had like roofs that had like little pebbles on the top of them, and they would nest on those pebbles because they'll nest on the ground basically in prairie areas, or kind of like in Michigan they nest in the pine barrens and places like that, in open areas. So maybe there's a way to treat our roofs to get more common nighthawks back.
I have seen that. So for our architect in the audience, when you're designing your roof, just make it strong enough that you can put crushed gravel on top. Make sure that it doesn't wash away. Pennsylvania Game Commission actually does this on some of their federal or state-owned buildings, and they do get nesting common nighthawks. So, yeah, good question.
Great. Well, I want to thank all three of you so much for being here tonight and for your insight and the work you do all year round. So thank you, and thank you all for coming in. And I think,
Well, thank you, Maiken, for your
Thank
wonderful
you.
conversation, and thank you to our audience for their incredible questions. It was a wonderful conversation. Maiken will be back on May 10th for another conversation about urban habitat. We're going to be talking about Lights Out Philly. Jason will join, as well as Keith Russell. So people who are involved in Bird Safe Philly and Lights Out Philly. So we'll actually talk specifically about that project, and we'll have an architect on the panel, as well as building owner managers who have been participating in that project. So we'll talk a little bit more about how buildings we can mitigate problems with glass. I just also wanted to mention a couple of other upcoming things. We're collaborating with DVOC and others on a bio blitz on May 1st. How many of you are on iNaturalist? Great. Yeah, so that's on a Monday, 12 a.m. to 12 a.m. a 24-hour BioBlitz. On May 25th, we're also working again with GVOC, co-sponsoring a program with David Lindo, the urban birder from the UK. That will be really special. And it's connected to our Black Birders Week, which is on May 27th, Black Excellence in Birding. We will be hosting another panel here. And I think there's a lot more birding stuff to come. But anyway, thanks again and have a wonderful evening.